Meyer Lansky himself and another gangster from Murder Inc. in Brooklyn dangled a loudmouth Nazi out the window of the Yorktown casino where they were having a rally. It's, should we, shouldn't we? Ah, and they dropped him.
My guest today is Michael Benson, the true crime author of the book Gangsters vs. Nazis, How Jewish Mobsters Battled Nazis in World War II Era America, where he tells the incredible real-life story of how Jewish gangsters disrupted Nazi gatherings in the United States during the late 1930s. Michael, thank you so much for being here. How are you doing?
Thanks, Ellie. Appreciate it.
No worries. So look, we spoke a bit before we started recording. I read the book, like I said, and I really, really enjoyed it.
Excellent.
And I'll tell you what it reminded me of. And I don't know if you've heard this before, but it reminded me a bit of The Sopranos, the way you wrote it, because you portray the characters in the book in such a humorous and likable manner. And I find myself in the position of rooting for them and cheering them on. The Jewish gangsters, that is. But I know that they were still gangsters. They're not necessarily the best of people. They were criminals who ruined a lot of lives as well at the end of the day. And, you know, I get that feeling watching The Sopranos. These are morally duplicitous people who we can't help but cheer on. I think you achieved that a lot through your writing. Was that intentional? And how do you feel about that paradox?
Well, I feel no qualms whatsoever about the morality of my book. The gangsters are the good guys. The Nazis are the bad guys. There are very few shades of gray. And it was absolutely purposeful because I believe that even really, really bad men can do great things. And I make no claims that the gangsters in my book are heroes before my book starts or after it's over. In fact, in the epilogue, we find out that a lot of them came to a bad end, as gangsters sometimes do. But during the book, they did great things, and therefore they are the heroes. I think my favorite analogy is I use the Dirty Dozen defense. I don't know if you're familiar with the movie. It's a World War II movie made in Hollywood in which 12 American soldiers who are in the brig and scheduled for execution, like the worst of the worst, you know, rapists and murderers, are given a chance to be free if they complete a suicide mission, fighting Nazis. So I realized that it is, as long as a person is fighting Nazis in your story, they're the hero, because Nazis are always going to be the villain. Always, 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 until we come up with somebody worse. But I don't think that's going to happen in our lifetime.
Yeah. I it would be terrifying if it did. Now, crucially, the Nazis in your book are not German Nazis. I mean, they get a mention, of course, but these are American Nazis. These are groups like the German American Bund. I hope I'm saying that right.
Yes, you are.
Thank you. Who they would masquerade their Nazi ideology as merely being an organization promoting the interests of everyday Germans. Right? Very innocent. We're just everyday Germans. What was the public perception of these groups? And to what extent did they get away with this farce?
Well, one thing I learned during my research for this book in particular is that in 1930s America, all racism, all bigotry was mainstream. The rules were that you could say whatever you wanted about a group of people as long as there wasn't a member of that group in the room. And nobody would say anything about it. It was okay. It's just the way it was. So, you know, the natural inclination for Gentiles in America was to not care what the German American Bund said about the Jews, because if they weren't a member of either group and they didn't have a dog in the fight. Now, Jewish Americans, on the other hand, it was scary times for them. They were getting letters from their relatives in Europe saying, your uncle got scooped up by the Nazis and I don't think he's coming home. Bad things are happening over here. So when Jewish Americans heard the rhetoric that the German American Bund and the Silver Lodge were using, They knew where that hate speech was headed, so they had no qualms about attacking it. Now, a couple of things I want to point out at this point. I did some math. About 0.2% of German Americans were followers of Hitler. So it's 99.8% of German Americans wanted nothing to do with German politics. They were in America now. Let's have dinner. The other thing is that while most Gentiles didn't react violently to the Bund's hate speech, in Rochester, New York, which I know because I grew up in Rochester, New York, the pre-existing German American organizations put out flyers saying don't have anything to do with the Bundists because they're haters and we don't do that in the city. And in Southbury, Connecticut, this is even more impressive. The Germans tried to come in, the Bund tried to come in and buy land when they were going to put up a camp for indoctrinating youth to the ways of Nazism. And the Protestant church in town had the zoning laws changed overnight so they could kick the Nazis out. And this is a case of a group that's not being attacked by the hate speech, hating the hate speech anyway. It's almost like a higher level of conscience that we see today, but we didn't see often back then. Almost like a quantum leap in conscience. And I have the honor in a few weeks. I'm going to be going to Southbury, Connecticut. I'm going to be giving the keynote speech at a dinner they're having to celebrate the 85th anniversary of the day Southbury kicked out the Nazis. Wow. And I'm going to show up with my slideshow and hopefully entertain them a little bit.
That's awesome, man. Now let's get on to really a pivotal, a really important character in the book, that being the New York judge, Nathan Perlman. He is the person who enlisted the gangsters to fight the Nazis and break up their meetings. Why did he go around the law in this way? And what would have happened if he were caught working with gangsters?
Well, yeah, those are two very different questions. First of all, he went around the law because the Bund was not breaking any laws. Story takes place at a time when hate speech laws were not even thought of. And some of the activities in this book were the reason why the subject first came up. What the Bundists were doing was they were committing cultural slander and in their pamphlets, cultural libel, but there were no laws against that. So the law wasn't going to do Judge Perlman any good whatsoever. Things came to a head in Manhattan when there was going to be a maritime organization ceremony on the steps of the U.S. Customs building in the southern tip of Manhattan in the Bowling Green area, not far from where the World Trade Center was. And they were about to have their ceremony, induct new members or whatever it was. And here come the Bundists down the street carrying signs saying ugly things about Jews and chanting. And there's a bit of a standoff. And eventually the patriotic Americans are forced to go inside the building to have their ceremony. Well, Judge Perlman hears about this and he gets ticked off. Now, he's a bit of a character. He was a former U.S. congressman. He was born in Europe, came over as a small child. And he was among the congressmen to vote to repeal prohibition, a fact that he never allowed his bartender to forget. So he goes into a saloon and he's thinking about this, and then he snaps his fingers. He says, "I got it. What these German Bundists need is a good punch in the nose." I mean, the way to shut up a guy who's saying bad things about you is to hit him in the face. And that, in other words, the earlier analogy about you can say whatever you want as long as a member of that group isn't in the room. Let the German Americans know we're in the room and shut them up. So he doesn't call Mayor LaGuardia, he doesn't call his congressman, he doesn't call the commissioner of police. He calls the number one Jewish gangster in the world, probably of all times, Meyer Lansky. Now, the other question was, what would happen if he got caught? I mean, it would have been terrible. There were plenty of Americans, even in New York, who would have seen this as an attempt to force America into the European war. Isolationists who may or may not have been anti-Semitic would have seen this as an effort to change foreign policy and to turn Americans against Hitler, as if such a thing wasn't inevitable.
Mm. Now, you mentioned Lansky there, and I want to get on to him because many people will have heard the names of the Jewish gangsters Meyer Lansky and Bugsy Siegel for their involvement with the Italian-American mafia, but they may be surprised to learn the extent of their involvement in breaking up Nazi activities. Now, for those who may not have heard of them, could you tell our listeners a bit about who they were and why they agreed to be a part of this?
Sure. Well, Lansky and Meyer Lansky and Bugsy Siegel were boyhood friends. They grew up in the Brownsville section of Brooklyn together. And in those days, it was very common for Jewish boys to be bullied by the Gentile boys. And they were thought of as soft, and they were easy to pick on. You didn't have to worry about it, any blowback. So Lansky and Siegel formed the Bugs and Meyer gang. It also includes other guys who become named gangsters as adults. And their whole purpose is to show the bullies that Jews can be tough. And if my book has a theme, that's it. That's it. This is what Judge Perlman wanted to demonstrate. This is what all the gangsters wanted to demonstrate. They wanted to show that you can't push us around anymore. We're going to fight back. And what you have is a series of brawls, and obviously in the overall picture, the war between Jews and Nazis, it didn't go well. But in America in 1938, the Jewish men win every single time, which I think is one of the reasons people find the book so entertaining. So Lansky and Siegel and their friends Mickey Cohen and Longy Zwillman in Newark, at time of Prohibition, all become bootleggers, and they're the top bootleggers. And just as they are used to beating up bullies, they do the same thing until they're among the last who are still selling illegal booze, and they're just making tons of money. In a world in which it's very, very difficult for Jewish men to make a lot of money, there just are not a lot of paths to the riches because America is dominated by WASP Protestants. When Nicholas Skank, the head of Lowe's Inc. and MGM Studios, was the 8th richest man in America during the 1930s, he was the only Jewish man on that list. And the entertainment industry was really the only industry where Jews had clout, a phrase that conspiracy theorists who are anti-Semitic often use to imply that there's some sort of massive web of conspiracy going on. And this is what the Bundists were doing. They were saying horrible things. We're about a decade into the Great Depression, and nobody has any money. It seems like nobody's ever going to have any money. And what the head Bundist, Fritz Kuhn, was saying was there's a reason for that. The reason is that the Jews have all the money, and until we get rid of them, we're not going to get any. So the way to solve America's problems are the same ways to solve Germany's problems. We got to get rid of the Jews. And that's the kind of talk that earned them, a couple of loose teeth and a bloody nose on several occasions.
Yeah. Can you tell us a bit about Fritz Kuhn, the leader of the Bund?
Yeah, interestingly, he worked for the Ford Motor Company at a time when Henry Ford was rumored to be not fond of Jewish people. Jewish people weren't allowed to work there, and he eventually got himself fired for dallying with women employees, and he eventually he was doing his Hitler impression in the dark room while developing some film, and that got him fired. But I suspect it may be a cover story, maybe, because somebody was financing the German American Bund, and Kuhn was the assumed leader. So it would make sense that his corporate connections may have led to the next stage in his life, but they came up with a story to explain why he was no longer working for a car company. Um, he was a man of terrible character, as you might imagine. A lot of the Bundists were. They tended to be, pedophiles who were liars and cheaters and philanderers and and he eventually was arrested for embezzling from the Bund itself.
Yeah.
He's charging money for things and then keeping the money himself. He was a loner, a womanizer, twice. Oh, he was a drinker, constantly doing shots of schnapps. He would drive around the country going from his various bases, and twice he claimed he woke up with his car half hanging off of a bridge because he'd fallen asleep at the wheel. And they would beg him, please let us, you can afford a driver. But he'd go, no, 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 no. So he was up to things he didn't want anybody to know about.
Right.
And it was true that I guess this would figure that the 0.2% of German Americans who were into this, they weren't the German Americans with the greatest character. So he was he's an appropriate villain for my book. He would thrust out his jaw and a little bit of Mussolini in his speech patterns too, but he would spew spittle when he spoke and wave his arms as much like Hitler as he could, and he could get a crowd worked up into a frenzy.
Yeah. Yeah. Now, this 0.2%, this is the vocal minority causing havoc, for Jews in America. How concerned would you say the average Jew was of the Nazis in the United States, and to what extent were their lives being impacted?
It was a terrifying time for Jews in America because they did know that the Holocaust was commencing in Europe, and you had people in America who were saying the same things Hitler said, and nobody was vocally opposing them. So, the Nazis were envisioning a world without Jews and saying, "Oh, wouldn't that be a great thing?" And they did their best to make that so. But the anti-Nazi forces in Newark, in particular, they were known as the Minutemen, and they because they only needed a minute to react to some Nazi thing that needed to be stomped. And at one point, there was close to 1,000 of them, and obviously they weren't all gangsters. There was Vloggy's Willman put Nat Arno, a former boxer, in charge of the team, and tough guys from all over Newark in the Northeast would attack the hall, the Schwabenhall, where the gangsters were having their rallies. And the best way to tell what happened was to check the records for the emergency rooms that night, because you could figure out what the injuries were. And the Germans took the worst of it. And usually the injuries were not that severe. I think the worst one in the book is a broken femur, because Meyer Lansky himself and another gangster from Murder Inc. in Brooklyn dangled a loudmouth Nazi out the window of the Yorktown casino where they were having a rally. It's, should we? And they dropped him. And he landed feet first and broke his leg. If he'd landed head first, obviously the no-kill rule. I should mention the no-kill rule. Judge Perlman and Rabbi Stephen Lansky have a sit-down with Rabbi Stephen Wise have a sit-down with Meyer Lansky, and they said, "Can you punch out some Nazis for us?" And he says, "Sure. I have some boys. They're called Murder Inc. We can do better than punch." And the rabbi turns pale, goes, "No, no, no." And Judge Perlman says, "You must realize, Meyer, that if you start killing these guys, we're going to lose the moral high ground, and it's all going to be over right away." And Lansky sees the wisdom in this. Always better not to shoot. He says, "Okay, we won't kill them. We'll just marinate them." So yeah, the rest of the book is Jewish tough guys marinating Nazis.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned something before, and something about Nat Arno and the Minutemen. Something that really surprised me was just how many of the Jews involved in disrupting Nazi activities were boxers or people involved in boxing, which I didn't expect. Some of my favorite people mentioned in the book, Nat Arno, Barney Ross, and Davy Miller. While the mobsters made all of the arrangements, it was for the most part Jewish boxers who were really beating the people up, it seemed. Why did Jewish boxers have such close ties with Jewish mobsters?
Well, for one thing, the boxing, the prize fight game in the United States at that time was run by the mob. The mysterious Mr. Gray It ran the fight game in America, and so there was a thin line between boxing and organized crime to begin with. And of course, fights were fixed and blah, 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 blah. There's a lot of corruption. But also, boxers had a limited choice of jobs they could do when they were through boxing, depending on how many of the marbles they still had. But they could be bodyguards and bouncers and collectors and various jobs that you could do for organized crime. So there was a blend. The gangsters were used to using boxers as their soldiers in wars. You when one gang's fighting another gang, um, you would send out your tough guys, and they would meet and fight it out. So yeah, there's an absolute strong connection. Nat Arno, and this is one of my favorite stories. Uh, the day after Pearl Harbor, he enlists in the U.S. Army, and he is among the troops who lands at Normandy on D-Day. He ends up marching all the way to Berlin, touring Europe the hard way, as I say. And he claims that on 2 occasions, he saw German POWs being marched in the opposite direction, who he recognized and who recognized him from street fights they had had in Newark, New Jersey. So
Wow.
it was the little war before the big war.
Yeah. Yeah. I got to ask, did you have any favorite Jewish mobsters in the book?
I like Mickey Cohen. Um, I don't know if you're familiar with the movies, the Bowery Boys series that they used to make back in the 40s and 50s. Probably not. But the hero of those movies was a fellow named Slip Mahoney, who was a malaproper, and he would never get his English right. He would screw up the words, and especially long words would be replaced by words that sounded like it, but it meant something completely different, and to humorous results. And this was Mickey Cohen. Mickey Cohen always used words that he thought were correct but weren't, and he was a tough guy. He started out as a New York newspaper boy, went to the West Coast while still a boy. He fought in tournaments. They used to have boxing tournaments for newsies, little boys that sold newspapers on the corner. Extra, extra. All of them would get together and they would have boxing matches, and grown men would sit around and watch these 10-year-olds, beat
Wow.
the jeepers out of each other and gamble. I want the kid in the dark trunks. So the morality, that's a little sketchy, but kids learn to be tough. And Mickey Cohen went to LA, as did Bugsy Siegel. They were ordered to run the rackets out there, which was a complicated task because in Los Angeles, the police, the the politicians, the judges, the gangsters, the movie moguls were all in one big pot of corruption. So you couldn't necessarily tell who was who. Mickey Cohen and Bugsy Siegel beat up a couple of Nazis who were also LA cops, but they weren't worried about the police chief being mad at them because they were in business with the police chief. And he didn't care if one of his officers was beat up. It didn't bother him much as long as he got a piece of the action of whatever they were running. So yeah, but I also like Long East Willman. He was one of those boys who's 6 foot tall when he was 13, so he was known as Longy, and his real name was Abner. And he was best known in his neighborhood in Newark as a defender of little Jewish boys against bullies, as Lansky and Siegel in Brooklyn. And if there was problems, you could get Longy, and Longy would come in, he'd clean house and make sure all of the the thick necked Gentile boys would scatter. And he grew up to be probably the biggest bootlegger in America. He ran the East Coast's booze and was for a while he dated movie star Jean Harlow, which was must have been nice work if you could get it. She eventually broke up with him because she had to go to Hollywood and work for Howard Hughes. And during the gangster versus Nazis fights, he used to get calls from his mom. Abner, those men are bothering the rabbi again, and he would make a phone call, and the Minutemen would be there in 60 seconds, and the bullies would wish they hadn't.
Wow. Wow. You mentioned LA a moment ago, which is a setting, one of the book's settings, and you write how Nazi Germany's propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels told Hitler that Hollywood was the world's greatest propaganda machine. What was the Nazis' plans for Hollywood?
Oh boy. Well, Goebbels had his eye on LA from the earliest days of the Nazis' rise to power. He told Hitler that Hollywood was the world's greatest propaganda machine. Hollywood movies were not only shown across the United States, but elsewhere in Europe as well, around the world. And to control the message coming out of Hollywood was to, dare he say it, rule the world. And Hitler had ideas that, if he could just get control of information systems in the United States, he could swing the national opinion towards him, and he might be able to conquer the United States without ever firing a shot. It didn't occur to him that the United States was going to come over across the Atlantic and fight him. That seemed ridiculous to him. He claimed, I got the idea of genocide from the Americans when they wiped out the Native Americans when they got there. So the Nazi infiltration into Los Angeles began in 1933. They published pamphlets. They had recruiting meetings. The trouble was, as Hitler eyed Los Angeles hungrily, he couldn't conceive of how new and without tradition Los Angeles was. Fully half of Los Angeles residents had been in the city for less than 5 years. 90% had been in town for less than 15 years. Second generation Angelenos were few and far between. And all of the movement had to do with the entertainment industry. The only people who had been there for more than 2 generations were the oil people, who, because you could drill for oil in your backyard and become a millionaire. And those were the people that Hitler finally decided might be on his side. But there wasn't a lot of traction there either, because they might have been anti-Semitic, they might have been, they might have been anti-Hollywood, but they weren't militant. I thought Hollywood was kind of disgusting with the orgies and the drugs, blah 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 blah. But they stay on their side of the city, we stay on our side of the city, everything is good. And what Hitler failed to do was he failed to put a strong leader in charge of his gaining control of Hollywood scheme. He had 3 guys who were sort of a 3-headed monster. And what happened was a Jewish lawyer by the name of L.L. Lewis, he put together a team of spies, men and women were really important in this campaign. And they infiltrated the movement. This is pre-German American Bund by a few years. They infiltrated the movement and they just started spreading rumors. This guy said this about you, and this guy said that about you there. And pretty soon he had all of the three leaders stabbing each other in the back, and the thing fell apart. And it came out the plans were just horrible. I don't know how they planned to sway the hearts and minds of America by this, but they were going to kidnap top Jewish producers and directors and stars and hang them in public, like Eddie Cantor and Charlie Chaplin was on the list. But that was obviously they never got anywhere close to that. And Hollywood continued to make movies that were decidedly anti-Nazi. And as I said, the moguls were all Jewish men. They knew what was going on. And they were in turn being attacked by conservative Americans who wanted to stay out of World War II. And they were being accused of putting out propaganda that was going to get America into the war. And they said, well, we're not here to sway anybody's minds. You cannot accuse us of being anti-American, because we are not. If you want to accuse us of being anti-Nazi, go ahead. Go ahead. Let's see where that gets you.
Yeah. Now, in addition to groups like the Bund and Silver Legion, the book is also kind of full of these lone wolves, I suppose, these rogue Nazis. One that stuck out for me is the infamous Father Charles Coughlin,
Yes.
who was a priest with a radio program, used as platform to spread anti-Semitic vitriol. How does he fit into the story?
Well, Father Coughlin Uh, Started out as a fellow, began his own church in the Midwest of the United States. He asked for some free airtime to promote his church, and radio stations were always very charitable in that way. Usually on Sundays, that helped them fill out their programming. And after a few years, he has a syndicated radio show that's on Sunday afternoons. I think, ironically, his show was interrupted by news that the Japanese had bombed Pearl Harbor. I would like to have a tape of him going back on the air after the bulletin. Um, but and he was a very kind of a standard priest until the stock market crash and the beginning of the Great Depression, at which time he started to blame Jewish people for America's problems. And that increased. He would be accused of being anti-Semitic, and he would say, no, 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 I am not. I am anti-communist. But of course, all Jews are communists. So it seemed like a way of deflecting the question rather than really answering it. And it goes to show that, when Chicago gangsters and boxers took on the Nazis in that city, anti-Semitism was in the very air. It was being broadcasted.
I want to get on to something that you mentioned right at the start of the podcast, which were Nazi youth camps. Now, these were set up to indoctrinate young German Americans, and they were surrounded by controversies, some of which ended up going to trial. Can you tell us a bit more about these camps and ultimately their downfall?
Well, I think the thing that disgusts me most about all of this, I mean, it's bad enough that there were Nazi youth camps in Germany, but to have Nazi youth camps in Long Island, New York, or upstate New York, or outside of Chicago or outside LA, are just horrifying. And what they were, and these were set up by Fritz Kuhn, and the idea was to indoctrinate young people, but they went about it sneaky. They would have pretty girls hand out brochures on the street to men who look like they might be parents. And there was a brochure saying, send your kid to summer camp, a German summer camp, a white man's summer camp, where there was lots of fresh air and they would learn to play baseball and they could swim. Nowhere in the brochure is there a swastika. And the kid didn't even know what it was all about until they got there. And then there were swastikas everywhere. They were taught to march and goose step. They were taught to Sieg Heil. And every night they were given a long lecture on learning to love the glory that is Adolf Hitler and to hate Jews. And they were carefully placed. They were always just outside large city areas, just outside the jurisdiction of large city law enforcement, usually in small towns where they could overwhelm any law enforcement that might have objected to their activities. And it's just horrifying. The worst one, they had one set up in the Catskills of New York, outside New York City, which is known as the Borscht Belt, because that's where middle class Jews from New York would spend their summers. So you would have a nice little resort where there would be entertainment and stand up comics talking and people swimming and boating. And on the other side of the hill, if a kid went for a hike to the top of the hill and looked to see what was on the other side, they'd come back and say, "Mommy, why are there flags with spiders on them over there?" And they were swastikas.
Wow.
I was and it was meant as a threat to Jewish people. Yeah, we can even have our youth camp here on the other side of the hill from the place where you are having fun. It's despicable. They were horribly sexist to boot.
Yeah.
I guess this is predictable. Just as they were using the cute girls to be their recruiters in the big cities, apparently the male leaders of the camps were telling the boys that the girls were fair game sexually, and that a lot of the grown men who ran the camp were using the girls sexually. And as I think I mentioned pedophilia earlier, they did seem to have the PR head of the German American Bund was arrested because he'd snuck a little girl into a movie theater. only 3 weeks after he was arrested for exposing himself in Penn Station in New York City to another little girl. So it's just, they were bad people. And
Yeah.
the moral question of is it okay to punch them is pretty clear cut to me. Obviously, the thing that ended all of this was not just the fact that they could no longer speak freely without getting punched in the teeth, but once the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor, all of the free speech that they were hiding behind, and the second that we were at war with Germany, anything that they said pro-Hitler was sedition and a plot to overthrow the U.S. government, and they could be jailed. So it drove them completely underground. And in a lot of cases, the Germans who were attending those rallies, their noses having been fixed and their bloody lips having healed, were drafted in the U.S. Army, and they were sent to the Pacific where their allegiances would not be questioned. The Jewish tough guys, a lot of them were drafted as well. They went to Europe and fought the Nazis again, this time with bullets. And so everything changed. I think it's one of the reasons why this isn't a better known story. Usually, small stories that come just before huge stories tend to be forgotten by historians because they're overwhelmed.
Yeah, it's such an unbelievable story, and it really does deserve to be better known. Now, as we know, fortunately, the pro-Nazi efforts were ultimately unsuccessful, and the decline began in the late 1930s, almost right as the Nazi stranglehold in Europe ramped up. Now you mentioned the individuals, some of the individuals they got done for tax evasion, and the Bund's PR man. What were some of the decisive factors, the nails in the coffin, that ended up being the national downfall of this movement?
Well, Fritz Kuhn got to a point where he couldn't have a meeting without it being busted up by tough guys. So he decides he's going to use Mayor LaGuardia's rules in there. He left New York and moved to Newark because after the riot in New York at the Yorkville Casino, where the guy got dropped out the window, he made it tougher for the Nazis to have their rallies in New York. No uniform, you got to have your permits, all your ducks in a row, or else you can't do it. So they did the easy thing, and they just crossed the Hudson River and started again in a different state. But so Fritz Kuhn comes up with this idea. He's going to have a pro-American rally, American flags everywhere, blah, 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 in Madison Square Garden, the Mecca. And he's going to use the New York Police Department as his security. It's going to be by invitation only. He's going to fill the house with 19,000 Nazis, and the only non-Nazis who are going to be in the room are the members of the New York press. And he would use, to avoid a tremendous riot, he would use the NYPD to watch all of the doors. Now, as the rally is starting inside Madison Square Garden, outside, and it's a year later now, and a lot of groups are anti-Nazi. The gangsters they've been joined by other groups. The American Foreign Legion is there. Veterans of Foreign Wars are there. A lot of them fought in World War I, didn't like the idea of Germans becoming aggressive again, regardless of how they felt about Jewish people. So it's packed outside, it's packed inside. Nobody's getting in, nobody's getting out. Police are forming a human barrier between the groups. But one man sneaks into Madison Square Garden, an unemployed plumber named Dizzy. He sneaks in and he hides. And he waits until Fritz Kuhn is giving his speech. And he runs up, climbs up on stage, and he doesn't go for Fritz Kuhn, he goes for his electronics. He pulls the plug on his microphone, and he stands up, he says, "Down with Hitler!" At which time Kuhn's guards tackle him, and they pull down his pants. Ha 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 ha. Nazi humor, so funny. He's rescued almost immediately by the NYPD, and there are photos that look like the NYPD is attacking Izzy, but they're not. Izzy Greenbaum he's in good hands now. They get him outside. tell him to pull up his pants, and they take him to jail because he's created disturbance. He's disturbed the peace. Well, he spends the night in jail, and the next morning he is in court, and the courtroom is packed with Jewish men, all of whom want to be the one to pay his bail. Um, the morning newspapers, because he did this in front of the New York press, all of the newspapers say nothing, and Fritz Kuhn's frantic because he's expecting that every newspaper in America is going to be talking about this orderly, fantastic rally he had, and how great the uniforms look, how crisp everybody was, how the flags look great, George Washington next to Hitler, oh, it's great. And all the newspaper headlines are about Izzy and the heroic Jew who dared to stand up in the face of 19,000 Nazis. Izzy gets home to his beautiful wife and children, and there's a big gift basket. And his wife says, you know anybody named Meyer Lansky? And he goes, no. He says, well, he knows you. Look at the size of this gift basket. So he's a hero. After Pearl Harbor, he too enlists, fights the entire length of the war, and comes back, an American hero again. But, if ever there was one moment when the attempt to win the hearts and minds of Americans with Nazi philosophy plummeted, it was when, Izzy pulled the plug on Fritz Kuhn in front of the New York press.
Yeah, and you can actually watch that footage. I've seen it. It's
Oh,
quite
have you? Oh,
something.
yeah.
I recommend that the listeners go on YouTube. Marshall Curry's A Night at the Garden. It was nominated for an Oscar, and it captures this moment, and it really describes what you're talking about. This atmosphere of, like, thousands and thousands of Nazis in Madison Square Garden, and this one lone Jewish man trying to ruin it. It's really, really something. Check it out online if you haven't seen it already. Now we've discussed how the downfall of the Nazis took place. How did the downfall of the Jewish mob happen?
Well, interestingly, Meyer Lansky is never taken down by the law. He survives World War II. He's a very smart man. Uh, Basically, all they can catch him doing is being an accountant. He lives to be old. He is, in ways you may know more about than I, he's instrumental in the formation of Israel. I think he gives economic and some kind of strategic support for that. So again, he's a hero for his people. Um, the Jewish mob were, first of all, they didn't pay their taxes. Once Al Capone went down to tax evasion, every hood in America was in trouble because they didn't pay their taxes. And then eventually there were the RICO laws, which say that if you are the head of an organization that commits a crime, you have committed a crime even if you can't be directly linked to that crime. Your people did it, and you're in charge of your people, so you're guilty too. And that's how large groups of gangsters all went down together. But basically, I think the main thing that happened was that Jewish people in America had earned during World War II, as did Black people and other minorities, a greater piece of the pie. There were more opportunities to thrive without breaking the law. Interesting, Jewish boxers went away too. The the, the group that is boxing is usually the group that is it's almost below the low class. It's the prison class. People who box do it so that they won't go to jail. And as times improved, economy improved, Jewish fellas didn't really need to box that much anymore. They could do other things that didn't involve getting hit in the head, which was always an improvement. And that's what happened to the Jewish mob. It went into business.
Yeah. Yeah. Now, let's talk about how the book ends. The book ends by you asking who will step up to the plate now everyone mentioned in the book is no longer here. You write, and I quote, "When does our hero charge in and sock the Nazi with his philosophy of hate right on the jaw?" End quote. And, as we and many of our listeners know, neo-Nazis are not only still around, but have been becoming more vocal. and high profile as of late, disseminating flyers and performing public stunts in Jewish areas of the United States, much in the way that the German-American Bund did over 80 years ago. Michael, why do you think that, contrary to the Bund's activities during the 30s, neo-Nazis today feel free to congregate and disseminate their propaganda?
Well, it is true that the same things that happened in the 1930s in America are again happening today, but they're happening in a drastically different world in several ways. The situation here domestically, I think, is worse than it was in 1938. The emphasis now among neo-Nazis is to be armed to the teeth. Any physical attack upon them by Jews or anyone else would be greeted with gunfire. Now, in my whole book, there's only one gunshot, and it's one of the gangsters fires a shot into the ceiling and says, "That is what we do to Hitler's clowns." But nobody gets shot. Today, that would be the first thing that would happen, is somebody would get shot. The other thing is that hate groups are far better equipped now to disseminate their message than they were 80 years ago. Hitler wanted Hollywood so he could spread propaganda, but today's Nazis, they have the internet, they have right-wing television, right-wing radio. They're having no trouble getting their message out. Message is going out talk about anti-Semitism in the air. It's back. So I don't know how we take care of that. I would suggest that punching a Nazi in the nose would no longer be as effective as it was 80 years ago, and that's sad.
They neo-Nazis are still around. They have not gone away. I advise listeners to look at anti-Semitism groups like us and keep up with it and do your research and write to people in power, in charge of tell them what's going on, because they might not know and they need to know. Now, look, we've had
good work, Ellie. You guys are doing great work.
Thank you, Michael. Much appreciated. Now, look, I want to ask you a more lighthearted question. You write extensively about the mafia, and I would be remiss if I did not ask you, do you have a favorite mafia film?
Yeah. My favorite mafia film is The Godfather, Godfather 1. People who say Godfather 2 is maybe the only sequel that's better than the original. No, not even close. Godfather 1 may be the greatest movie ever made. I mean, if you watched it lately, it just soars the entire time. I'm also really fond of Goodfellas.
I love Goodfellas.
Which is, and Scorsese in general. But Francis Ford Coppola's The Godfather is the greatest movie ever made about the mafia. And the word mafia never once appears in the entire film. Yeah. By arrangement. I mean, it was... He had to promise not to use the word, or else so they wouldn't bust up his set.
Wow. Okay. Now look, as we sort of wrap up, I'm going to ask you a question that I ask all of our guests.
Sure.
If someone who is not Jewish approaches you and says they want to help in the fight against anti-Semitism, they want to be an ally, where should they start?
Well, I wrote out this answer because I thought it needed to be given a little thought. And once I start talking, it's sometimes, Anyway, be political. Start locally. Find the candidate who is most sympathetic towards the Jewish plight and vote. Democracy is the enemy of Nazis and fascism of any sort. Start a movement. Do not give them an official capacity in government, or they will start the mind-purging process. And don't be afraid of calling them by their name. Nazis. They're going to use euphemisms. Call them by their name. Just like the American Nazis of 1938, they're going to hide behind, the American or the British flag. Don't let them. Call them out.
Yeah, that's incredibly practical advice, I think. And listen,
and if you get a chance, if you're in the dark alley, punch them in the nose.
Now, please tell the listeners, what have you got going on? What have you got coming up? And where can people find you?
Okay. My next book is going to be a biography of Carmine Galante, who was the biggest heroin dealer in the world, another mafia book. But the one I'm working on now is I'm really excited about. It's about the early days of Hollywood, focusing on two brothers, most powerful brothers in Hollywood history. They were Jewish immigrants named Joseph and Nicholas Skank. And you've never heard of them. And that is because they preferred to remain behind the scenes, and they never used their names in logos because, skank's not that pleasant of a word. Uh, Joe Skank ran United Artists and formed 20th Century Fox. His brother Nicholas was the head of Lowe's Inc. When Marcus Lowe died as a young man, he took over Lowe's Inc., which ran MGM and the Lowe's Theater empire. And the supporting cast is pretty spectacular. You got Marilyn Monroe, G. Harlow, Buster Keaton, Fatty Arbuckle. It's going to be great. Huge book. It's going to take me next 6 months of my life. I'm going to be in silent movie land. Now, if you're looking for me on Facebook, I am at author Michael Benson, all one word, at author Michael Benson. And on Instagram, I am Michael Benson 655. And send me a direct message. I will be your friend. Reference this podcast, and I will automatically be your friend. And you can, just as the rules were during this hour, you can ask me anything.
All right. Michael Benson, I really enjoyed chatting with you. Thank you so much for coming on Podcast Against Antisemitism.
It's been great, Ellie. Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you.